Our next keynote speaker is the director of the Arctic Economic Council Secretariat located in Tromsø, Norway. And you actually have direct flights here from Oulu to Tromsø. Have tried it and loved it. You should too. Prior to joining the AEC, Anu worked as an advisor in political affairs and Arctic policy at the Embassy of Finland in Oslo. We already tried this song once, but now for the real keynote speaker and the Iron Maiden, hit it. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Oulu. It's great to be in my own hometown, so thank you so much for the organizers for inviting me here and for providing me the perfect excuse to come back home. I need to comment on the song. It's not really about the lyrics. It's really about me growing up with an older brother. I was forced to like metal, so I grew up with Iron Maiden. This has a beat which simply gets straight to my bones. My title does say that I'm the director, but I really feel like a preacher, an Arctic preacher. And my speech today is going to draw upon my experiences as one. I represent the Arctic Economic Council, or the AEC. We are an independent business organization created by the Arctic Council, meaning the governments in all of the 8 Arctic states. Our purpose is to facilitate Arctic business-to-business contacts and responsible economic development. We represent all the major business lines in the Arctic, from all of the 8 Arctic nations, from reindeer herders, small and medium-sized enterprises, to the big multinationals within shipping, mining, energy, you name it. We also include the 6 permanent participant or indigenous peoples organizations that are represented in the Arctic Council at our work. So we really know the Arctic. And today I'm going to first start by introducing you to the Arctic, to my Arctic, but also to the Arctic of those that we in northern Norway call with the less polite name of Søringa, meaning the southerners. I will present you with some of the challenges, mirroring especially the situation in the Nordic Arctic, such as infrastructure, the linkages that we need, dialogue, which is essential, and then the question of ethical guidelines. Let's see. No. Ta-da. So, what you see here is the general perception we have of Arctic. It's vast, inaccessible, remote, with very few people. I could have also added a picture of a polar bear and a melting iceberg. That is true, but it's only one part of the picture, because the Arctic is also a significant economy. It is part of the 8 major economies on a global scale. It is a large resource reserve, and it is first and foremost home. And in order to be able to operate in the Arctic, you really do need to understand the different variations in the Arctic. And in the AEC, we tend to differentiate between 4 different types of the Arctic. The Nordic Arctic, which is the most advantageous part of the Arctic. The North American Arctic, Russian Arctic, and interwoven to all of these, we have the indigenous Arctic. And they all differ in terms of geography, climate, development, and conditions of doing business. This is also Arctic. And this is the side of the Arctic that is probably least known on a global scale. That is the Arctic of already existing industrial activity. We have extraction of natural resources that is already taking place. Aquaculture, fishing, fish farming is big in the Arctic. We have major maritime transportation and a huge potential on that field. Tourism and connectivity, both in terms of infrastructure development, but also as a business opportunity. And it's true that the Arctic holds a vast potential. The Arctic Business Yearbook estimates that the Barents Euro-Arctic region holds an investment potential of 200 billion euros. The investment potential in northern Finland is 55 billion euros. That is the size of the state budget in Finland. Finnish Lapland has 3% of the country's population, but stands for 10% of our export, including tourism. The Arctic also contains potentially massive hydrocarbon resources and mineral resources. And I often get the question whether there is a need to develop those resources. And I tend to remind that Europe consumes 20% of the resources, but only produces 3 or 4. So I'm inclined to say that the answer is yes. And the fact is, with the opening up of the Arctic, the economic activity in the region will increase. With the changing landscape, we have new opportunities, and that also calls for a need for transportation infrastructure. Guggenheim Partners, a US-based investment company, says that they estimate the Arctic infrastructure investment needs for the next 15 years to be $1 trillion. In the Nordics, we have a great need for cross-border collaboration in planning and funding schemes for infrastructure. One of the practical examples that is currently one of the current topics is the Arctic Corridor, a railroad from Norwegian coast to Finnish Lapland, and thus further connecting it through the Baltic Connector to the Central European markets. If we think about how we can fund this infrastructure, we need to be realistic. With 4 million inhabitants in 8 different countries, that's probably not enough taxpayers to pay for those products. Therefore, the Arctic Economic Council sees the use of P3s, public-private partnerships, as a viable model for funding infrastructure development. That enables us to save taxpayers money, and instead of requiring an enormous amount of money to invest all at once, such as a deep water port development, that money could be partially or in total taken from commercial funds. And the annual cost could be fixed based on a long-term service contracts. And these partnerships could actually enable us to make the investments that are critical for our development. In one way, I say that we are victims up here in North. And we are victims of our traditional way of thinking. If you look at the transportation maps of the Nordic Arctic, most of the lines go north-south. That same goes for political decision-making. There are only a few examples of east-west connections. One of them is the railroad from Norwegian port of Narvik to the Swedish border. The other one is the Arctic Air Link, which was already mentioned, which I should have taken yesterday, but the flight was cancelled. That's another story. But anyway, the point is, we are not used to cross-border thinking in business either. A practical example. One of the leading operators in northern Norway is currently reconstructing a hallmark building in downtown Tromsø. And they have a wonderful philosophy when they want to do this. They want to make sure that they use as many local contractors as possible. But then there are certain elements where they can't find the competence in northern Norway. That's when they had to go to Oslo. And when I heard this, I couldn't help myself. I had to stand up and say, did you ever even consider going to northern Sweden or to northern Finland? Because I know that Oulu has one of the leading environments in 3D development, for example. And the answer was no. So we need to challenge ourselves to think more east-west. And this requires a change of mindset. I'd like to be visionary. And being visionary, I would like to speak of a borderless Nordic Arctic. This should sound familiar because really it dates back to the start of the Nordic collaboration. A lot has already been achieved. We have free movement of workforce, great collaboration within the fields of knowledge, education, and research. But there's always room for more improvements. I think that the industry should go out of their comfort zones and make the effort. It takes time to build those cross-border connections, but I think that the safe way to start should be with our neighbors. We have small cultural differences. We share a language in Scandinavia, at least on the social level. So the national borders shouldn't really be seen as obstacles. We have some practical challenges. The picture or the print screen that you see on the top is from Dafin.no, a Norwegian website which announces all the public procurement processes. One of the practical obstacles for Finnish companies is that many of the offers need to be turned in Norwegian, which is a problem for a small or medium-sized company. But we also do have solutions. We have mechanisms for dealing with trade barriers, such as the Freedom of Movement Council within the Nordic Council of Ministers. But here I say, being a bureaucrat myself previously, working for the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs for 10 years, that business also needs to look itself in the mirror. We need to become better at informing of these obstacles that we face. So don't hesitate to call your local bureaucrats and tell them what you find and what you experience on the field. Building upon the regional cross-border thinking, I'd like to go even further, because we all know that profitable businesses demand that value chains exist. Without them, the economic assets of the Arctic, meaning our natural resources, are only consumed instead of creating added value locally. But here we come again to the question of only 4 million inhabitants in our 8 countries. This is probably not enough to create value-adding business on all of the fields. Therefore, we should consider combining these Arctic value chains to the global ones. And here again, my challenge is to start with your neighbors and then potentially go global together. When doing this, we need to make sure that the local environments, the societies, and the traditional livelihoods are respected when integrating the Arctic SMEs to the global value chains. The Arctic Economic Council was born out of the Arctic Council's acknowledgement that the increased economic activity in the Arctic can lead to the betterment of the socio-economic conditions in the Arctic. And with the AEC, both the Arctic businesses and the indigenous peoples are on the driver's seat when it comes to the development of our region. I often face a discussion of whether there is enough of a legal framework in the Arctic. Is it safe to do business there? There is even an ongoing discussion as to whether we should have an Arctic treaty, such as the Antarctic Treaty. And here I can say, rest assured, there is one major difference between the Antarctic and the Arctic. Underneath the ice in the Antarctic, you have a continent. Underneath the ice in the Arctic, you have sea. So UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, applies in the Arctic. It's not a Wild West. Climate change is happening, that is a fact. And the Arctic grows in economic importance. And while it does that, there are new risks that need to be managed. Those concern the use of resources, the impact on fragile ecosystems, technical limits, operational safety, and first and foremost, the welfare of our communities. To harvest the potential that the Arctic has, we need knowledge. And therefore, academia is the key. We need to get the business to better collaborate with the academia. And here I have to say that the rest of the Arctic is not as good as always doing this. We also need to make sure that when we operate in the Arctic, we use the best possible knowledge and best possible technology and services. And I have to say that our membership at the AEC is somewhat concerned about the current trend globally with increased protectionism. This might also hinder the transfer of best possible technology. Working in the North requires Northern knowledge, and this is best among those who live in the North, the locals and the indigenous. We need to integrate their voices into the development and the decision-making and the operations. We believe that the use of local knowledge and indigenous knowledge can be a necessary de-risking agent when operating in the Arctic. Sustainable development is really all about the economic and the social and the environmental being intertwined. And the AEC has always advocated a balanced and holistic approach to this. Another good example of ethics in Arctic business is the World Economic Forum's previous Global Agenda Council on the Arctic. This group existed until 2016, and it created a product titled Arctic Investment Protocol, basically setting up standards for sustainable investments in the Arctic. While this group no longer exists, the Arctic Economic Council has decided to give this product a new home. We look forward to further developing the concept. There is indeed an ongoing discussion among our members as to whether we should have a code of Arctic business ethics. Another challenge that we all should be aware of is that many of the decisions affecting the life in the Arctic and our conditions of doing business are done elsewhere. And sometimes, unfortunately, those making those decisions have limited or no knowledge about the reality in the Arctic. There is a great wording in the United States called educating the decision makers. That's exactly what we need to be doing. The decision makers often have excellent bureaucrats helping them, but the challenge that we face is that the rotation is very fast. It takes about a year and a half to educate your own decision maker. And once you're done with that, they usually move forward. So this needs to be an ongoing process. We, as representatives of the Arctic, are never done with this work. So we need to make sure that our voices are heard. We want to ensure that the business that is done in the Arctic is done with the local peoples and with the local businesses on the driver's seat. To conclude, be mindful that we need to be vocal, we need to join forces, we need to keep the infrastructure development on the agenda, and we need to educate the decision makers and inform them of the challenges that we face. I'd also like to challenge you to think outside the box. East has long been, to some extent, a forbidden direction for us Finns, but really, we should start to look more at east-west instead of thinking north-south. This is how we start to create pan-Arctic business opportunities, but we do need to change our mindset. And we should also be brave enough to take the step further and go global. A good way of doing that could be starting practicing with our local partners and then taking the step together. And then third point, just do it, but make sure that you do it right. Use science and knowledge as your basis, and use northern knowledge from those that know it best, meaning those who come from the Arctic. Thank you for your attention.